Good day. Today, I will be giving an example of a paper review based on the paper provided. I'll be taking up a paper entitled Business Intelligence and Analytics for Value Creation, the Role of Absorptive Capacity. This paper is taken from the International Journal of Information Management in the year 2019, authored by Katerina Buzik and Vlado Dimovsky. I'm not very familiar with them, but the journal is a highly cited journal, and maybe we can consider this as one of the A-list journal or one of the best journal in as indexed by Web of Science. So without further ado, we will start with the main argument of the paper. So the main argument of the paper in general is the absorptive capabilities enables transforming business intelligence and analytics insights into valuable knowledge. So there are keywords here: absorptive capacities capability. In general, this is absorptive capacity, which will be defined later, and the transformation into analytics insights into valuable knowledge. We believe, or we have an assumption that business intelligence will produce analytics insight, but in terms of transforming that into valuable knowledge, it's up for the organization to exploit the capability which is viewed under absorptive capacities capabilities. To illustrate the problem statement is how are business intelligence and analytics triggered insights transformed into valuable knowledge. Here, the paper is looking at the role of business intelligence and analytics in the process of knowledge generation from external data, and with it the underlying mechanisms that facilitate this process, which is viewed under the concept of absorptive capacity related the concept and or other consider this as construct of the absorptive capacity, and BI assets, which are actually existing concepts about the organization, which will be elaborated later. So we will go back to the problem statements. We are looking is here, the question is about how, that means it will somehow illustrate some processes in which the organization can transform um, business intelligence and analytics insight into valuable knowledge. So let's go back to foundational concepts. So the important thing about the enrolling at the doctorate level is to emphasize on the foundational concepts, because we are supposed to be required to illustrate that we have contributed something to the foundations of the discipline where we are coming from. This is an important aspect in the contribution of knowledge for any doctorate degree, unlike MS, where we just have to illustrate that we are knowledgeable enough about a certain aspects or discipline. So here, we will start, since our subject is on business intelligence, we will adopt a definition defined by the paper of what is business intelligence and analytics. And here, we are looking at business intelligence and analytics at the same thing, although in general, some body of knowledge might differentiate between the two, but in this paper, I would like to emphasize that I cannot see the difference as illustrated by the author. In fact, uh, the authors combined shortcut the term business intelligence and analytics into BIA. So they adopt a certain definition of business intelligence into techniques, technologies, systems, practices, methodologies, and applications that analyze critical business data to help an enterprise better understand its business and market, and make timely business decisions. So it's really obvious that business intelligence is related to business decisions. So here, um, unfortunately, business intelligence is very broad, is viewed as very broad aspects of business decisions, relate business decisions, and it can be anything, as the definition said. It can be anything as long as it will help you analyze data that will help enterprise understand basically its environment to help make them timely decisions, or effective decisions, or in this case, it's timely, it's efficient decisions. So, on the other hand, Another important concept from the problem is that absorptive capacity, because this paper has been viewed on the perspective of the absorptive capacity or the ability of a firm to recognize the value of new external information, assimilate it, and apply it to commercial ends. So basically, this is our ability to to identify opportunities, assimilate or integrate it into our organization and apply it. Meaning assimilate pa is looking at the organization and how we can adapt that new information from external sources and apply it to commercial ends. There are also absorptive capacity where knowledge is coming from internal or external knowledge or from within and outside the organization. But this paper is emphasizing the absorptive capacity from outside of the organization. But do not limit yourself on the concept of absorptive capacity might be coming from uh, inside the organization. Anyway, the target is to to get a value from certain information and the process of applying it. So if we look at the concept of absorptive capacity, there are three of in this paper. It doesn't adapt three, I think, but we here, if we can check, one is to recognize the value of new external information. Second is the process of assimilation, and third is applying it into commercial ends. I mean, we will discuss this later, how the paper has been organized in the perspective of absorptive capacity. Um, Here, I'm considering this something like a hypothesis that the higher the level of absorptive capacity, the higher the spillovers between internal and external knowledge sourcing. So meaning, we have here an important concept is the higher level of absorptive capacity, but meaning the more knowledge that you can assimilate and somehow apply it to the organization or to the existing processes or practices, the higher the spillovers between internal and external knowledge sourcing. That means, now, although here absorptive capacity is considered as external, but this is the mix of external knowledge. So that means we are not only dependent on the knowledge within the organization, but there's always a mix of information for the purpose of decision making or improving processes, the internal and external knowledge. And we have the spillovers. I think the term spillovers here is the um, uh, mix of internal and external knowledge. And although this is an economic term, spillover is an economic term, and here is used as a knowledge between in the organization. Um, so we have a further definition of the absorptive capacity. The reason for this one is that I emphasize the importance of um, learning the theoretical aspects, because somehow we are targeting that we will be used to this one, because this can be considered as construct later in your theoretical framework or in your conceptual framework or even your operational framework. And we define here as three aspects are looking at the absorptive capacity. We have absorptive capacity as domain specific. That means the ability to determine the value of the external knowledge depends on prior related knowledge, meaning so domain specific, one particular knowledge. Another is firm specific. We describe absorptive capacity as firm specific. That means depends on the absorptive capacities of a firm's individuals, meaning people in the organization. However, it is not just the sum of individuals' capacity, but it also composed of the overlapping of individuals' knowledge and the knowledge transfer occurs within subunits. So this is relationship related, firm specific, and these are individual and the relationship between individuals. Path dependent means absorptive capacity accumulation in one period will therefore allow more efficient absorptive capacity accumulation in the next. So that means if we are used to considering absorptive knowledge from previous practices, then it's easier or it's better, more absorptive capacity in the recent years. So we have for absorptive capacity for first order capabilities that reflect dynamic process. So as I've said before, there are only three major processes in the illustrated in the definition, but if we will look at this one, the absorptive capacity dynamic process would be acquisition, assimilation, transformation, and exploitation, where acquisition refers to the identification and obtainment of information through external sources relevant to firm's operation and is affected as well by the prior knowledge. So this is your data gathering outside of your organization. So this is acquisition, or identifying relevant information in your organization or practices that might help in the future or can be assimilated in your organization. The second is assimilation, refers to the firm's ability to analyze, interpret, and understand externally acquired information. So that means we are looking here at the alignment maybe of the information that you have acquired outside of the organization and the appropriateness of that information given your existing practices or your organization in general. So that's assimilation. That means the process of assimilation is just an analysis of existing practice of the organization and looking at outside information if it can help with your existing process. The third one is transformation. This refers to developing routines that facilitate a combination of existing knowledge with new acquired knowledge and internalization of this knowledge. Meaning here we will develop here the process, or we'll set up a certain process that will facilitate the combination or the integration of that new acquired knowledge from outside to be integrated within. So if we will look at the definition, this is not really it was not illustrated, but here we know that an organization still needs to develop routines or like I am usually this looking at specific aspects of the organization that can be acquired. And lastly is exploitation. This refers to an application of the acquired transformed knowledge to commercial ends. So that means this is already implementing or deployment of the existing knowledge to the organization. Personally, I will just share my knowledge about dynamic capabilities. I can consider acquisition, assimilation, and exploitation as the major process, as I've learned that dynamic capabilities in general, some originators of dynamic capabilities can be viewed into three processes, but this is a very good illustration also of dynamic capabilities given the organization or looking at the theoretical aspects. And on the other hand, the paper is also looking at the underlying assets that will support the process. So this is a very common aspect, but there's something new here that I've introduced before, the relationship assets, which is about people. And this is, if you look at the business intelligence asset, they're looking at three major aspects. The first one is technological assets, which technological assets, human assets, and relationship assets, where technological assets refers to technical platforms, IT infrastructure, physical IT assets, data repositories, communication technologies, and IT architecture. So this is technological aspect. We know that business intelligence will not prosper without the infrastructure needed for the data to be stored or for certain devices that will capture the human beings a certain aspect of the organization. So these are an infrastructure that needs to be supported, software and hardware. And the second part is human assets. These are the workforce of the business knowledge, skills, work experience, and relationships. So we're looking at here at an individual human being as one of the human assets. That means we are checking if the organization is actually capable of doing the we have a certain knowledge about business intelligence applications and orientation or applications of BI and analytics to the organization. And lastly, relationship assets encompasses in interdivisional relationship or external client networks or management sponsorship and culture. So these are relationships of different human beings. And if you look at in general the BI assets, it's more of the perspective of this paper is more of the human beings, because the social aspects, I mean, because if we look at it at the socio-technical level, we give more emphasis on the human assets, meaning maybe the business intelligence asset relies more on the human aspects rather than the technology itself, because here two major assets has been viewed as related to social aspects or human beings, while only one is considered technological. So we understand that the emphasis of this paper is more on the human beings. And so what's the methods and the context of the study? So the research is a qualitative research in nature, and they interviewed 14 key informant interviews in 9 European firms, which will be illustrated later in a table form. And they've used adaptive method of inquiry, which is founded on theoretical purposeful sampling approach in selecting participants in the study to ensure relevant representation of the actual state. That means theoretical and purposeful. Uh, this is purposeful sampling. They have certain criteria. And theoretical sampling, that means if it contributes to the theoretical perspective that we are looking. And firms from different sectors have, so the 9 European firms, those are European, the consideration and the screening criteria. Number one is having deep knowledge about the organization and having more than 3 years of experience in business intelligence and analytics initiatives and being at leading IT management position. And out of 14, 5 key informants were selected through snowball method. Okay. So these are the details. They've interviewed a CEO, uh, CIO, market research manager, IT manager, head of research and development. We have also managing director, um, um, among others. From how many countries? Croatia, Slovenia, Australia, Germany, and from different industry type, sector on site, and some are on Skype. So the data analysis procedure is um, they followed a naturalistic and constant comparison because this is common for inductive method, meaning instead the common practice is deductive, but usually deductive applies how should I more on the quantitative data, and here they are qualitative data, so they are more on inductive type. So to assure better quality and accuracy of the coding process, two independent reviewers coded the same data, and then they combine maybe after. So first is identifying initial first order codes that were informant centric. That means uh, during the interview, the transcript of the interview has been coded or labeled to identify the appropriate term or theme that might be derived from the interview. Second, they do the actual coding or seeking similarities and differences between amongst the categories. This is also done through constant comparison. And third is assembling first order codes into theoretical categories. At this point, actually, we are looking at the theoretical perspective that we are using, which is the dynamic capability theory and the business intelligence asset as mentioned earlier, and we assemble the first order and the through actual coding. So they assembled or grouped the different themes according to the theory, and so then distill the emergent theoretical categories into aggregate codes. So, uh, so so the result would be this one. We have the first order, meaning the first order codes, which are informant centric. That means these are labels provided by the coded by two independent coders. Then after that, we have theoretical categories. The theoretical categories are grouping of the first order codes where the theoretical categories is coming from the perspective of the paper, which is dynamic capability and the assets. Tapos the aggregate theoretical dimensions are presented as you cannot see the other one. This is absorptive capacity and the PI assets. Actually, what the paper was doing was that they've looked at in an inductive way the orders for the codes shared by the participants and connecting that in their theoretical categories, which they already identified, or it might be later they've identified that these are the theoretical codes based from the existing literature and the theoretical dynamic capability theory as already used theory to guide the investigation. And let me go back. So that means let me correct myself. The initial codes, after that they conduct theoretical coding, then assembling first order into theoretical categories and distill the emergent categories into aggregate theoretical dimensions. So that means uh, so it might be na they're not really one thing that is not clear for me is that if they have decided first on the use of absorptive capacity at the start of the research. Although when you look at the research question, it might be that they have already at the very start the absorptive capacity as one of the theoretical perspective that they are adopting in the paper. Um, so actually, this is also the result of the study. If you look at the first order codes, looking at the acquisition capability, which is the capability of the in the organization to acquire knowledge outside of the organization. If you look at the first order codes we have here, obtaining valuable data from external sources, a vast amount of data is in unstructured form, relevant information search, data inconsistency and incompleteness, and understanding of target sample. So that means they have more challenges on the acquisition capability, okay? Because first obtaining valuable data, so they might be it might be viewed as majority of the first order codes must are challenges or understanding, inconsistency, relevance. Okay, if you look at the assimilation capability, questions defined according to business needs, data interpretation requires data savvy personnel, interchange of ideas stimulate data understanding. So, and if you look at also the transformation capability, newly acquired knowledge needs to be linked to existing, transforming into understandable formats, okay, and the rest. And for technological assets, we look at technological advances to follow changing data requirements, new infrastructure architecture and programs, performance scalability and response times. Human assets, for example, making sense of data, analytical knowledge and skills combination, and difficulties in finding appropriate labor. And so if you look at this one, the paper is actually examining these different situations and looking at the theoretical perspective. That means we can we can assess or we can correlate that the more, for instance, if we look at human assets, if you can make more sense of data acquired and if you have more skills, analytical skills combined with knowledge, and if you don't have difficulties in finding appropriate labor, that means you have a better asset so that it can support more on your BI 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 um, initiative. And for action example, if we look at the first order codes under exploitation, reuse of accumulated knowledge, new products and services development, market and customer understanding. So that means you are exploiting more on the capability, or the more capabilities you had, the more absorptive capacity it is, the better the absorptive capacity, or the more positive aspect of your um, of these dynamic capabilities, or the more dynamic capabilities the organization has, the more absorptive capacity they have. So let's move to a theoretical contribution. The theoretical contribution is it might be insufficient to focus on improved decision making without considering how knowledge creation occurred in the first place. Correct? And this paper emphasized the importance of having personnel equipped with both domain and data knowledge, so pattern identification and insight discovery are possible, since the value of information contained in some data depends mainly on the intended application and the contextualization. The study turns attention to the potential drawbacks of BI and analytics use regarding poor technological performance, scalability, long response process, high cost labor storage, long learning process will ultimately lead to reluctance in BI and A use. So this is a human aspects, and we have also second to the last, we have found that the relationship assets significantly influence the realized absorptive capabilities, which is transformation and exploitation, uh, because they are very dependent on capabilities, you know. And lastly, highlights the need for aligning existing firm with the considered data strategy with strong culture tolerable for mistakes. And implication for practice, the value of the information in the first place comes from the intended application. Firms firm needs strong cultural commitments and symbiotic data and strategies to eliminate organizational barriers for delivering business intelligence and analytics. Consistent business intelligence and analytics use in day-to-day activities as well as decisions are only possible if the technology is trustworthy. That means presentation. Actually weird. The paper is looking at how it will be presented, means how you communicate actually the information derived from external sources, meaning if you have the more information that the organization can understand better, that means it's easy for decision makers to adapt that information acquired. And even if you have acquired information and if it's not on time, it will not really help the organization. That's why the infrastructure or assets of BI assets of the organization is one consideration as explained in the paper. The result of the paper is actually we'll go back to here because we will examine the if we will examine the relevance or the research question. Let's go back. Let me go back to review first the research question so that we can understand how we can conclude or connect. How are business intelligence and analytics triggered insights transform into valuable knowledge? So how that means it's the process. No? If we are asking about the process and there is a follow-up statement that the process of knowledge generation from external data and the underlying mechanisms that facilitate it. That means we're looking at the absorptive capacity and BI assets, how they facilitate the process of transforming or generation of external data into valuable knowledge in the organization. And if we look at this one, the assets is actually, and the result can be analyzed as a hypothesis of the process. That means there's an arrow here, the theoretical categories, as I've explained before, that the greater you have the acquisition capability, the more assimilation and transformation capability and exploitation, the better it is the the valuable knowledge can be transformed in the insights into valuable knowledge. And that means you have the greater absorptive capacity. If you have greater different capabilities, meaning you have good absorptive capacity. And in this paper, they identify in the perspective of the organization what are the aspects that needs to be considered in order for increased acquisition and in return increase absorptive capacity of the organization. And if we look at the capability of the organization or the absorptive capacity in general, it also depends on the business intelligence assets, which is identified in this paper as technological, human, and relationship. And if we look at what contributes more on how the organization will address the asset needed. If we look at the human assets, difficulties in finding appropriate labor. So that means one challenge that must be addressed is on the limited number of people knowledgeable on BI and analytics. And the middle and the second number two, analytic knowledge and skills combined with domain knowledge. That means you are both knowledgeable on technology and at the same time on the business domain where you belong. And the first is making sense of data requires human participation. That means collaboration of people. And that assets can be, if you will make positive of this one, that means you have better assets in the organization. If we look at really the general, the paper on how the go back to research question is, it's not really clear. There is no certain results that will illustrate the connect or the process of how, but you can understand it in the explanation for each category, because if you review the paper, each of this section has been discussed and each of these assets has been discussed within the paper, which is the sense of the paper, but it doesn't really illustrate the process in answering the research question. Still, they go back onto the main arguments, which is answering the research question, but not on as detailed as I've expected when I read the paper on the abstract. So lastly, this paper is actually explaining the interplay of absorptive capacities, underlying capabilities with the underpinning assets, providing a theoretical explanation of the process of delivering value regarding knowledge creation. Then if we will re-explain it, the value creation is actually delivered if you have more absorptive capacity and the underlying assets are actually provided. And this paper has given us insights on the theoretical explanation based on empirical data. And I think that's it. Sorry for some of the disturbances. Good day again.